Hey, hey, test one, two, A1, 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 A test one, two, A1, test one, two, check test, A test one, two, A1, test one, two, check test. Leave, check this. لا, belongs to who? It belongs to you? Okay. A1, check test one, two, A1, check test one, two.
واحد اتنين تلاتة واحد اتنين تلاتة. تيست مايك تيست مايك. تمام تمام تمام. تيست مايك 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 تيست مايك.
سعادتك والمايك دايما مفتوح. That's belongs to you. This mic for you. This mic for you. Here. Not this. Here. Oh.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending this late session. It's great to have you all. I know it's the end of the day, so people can be a little bit tired, but we still have a very interesting topic ahead of us that we would like to talk to. I know it's been private sector has been discussed all day long. It is a very important subject. I'm Khaled Hamza. I'm the director for the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development here in Egypt. I'm very happy to be accompanied by a very distinguished panel where we will be discussed enhancing the private sector role. We will be discussing the importance of the private sector, what kind of policies can be made to enhance the role of the private sector, and other concepts. I'll just start maybe a little bit, take a minute to reflect on the subject itself. I wrote down a few notes just to say, why are we talking about the role of the private sector? It must be important, and the importance of the private sector role comes from a number of activities and points. The ILO, International Labour Organization, states that in most countries, private enterprises create the most jobs. So in developing countries, over 90% of jobs are created in the private sector, so largest employer. Private sector provides all goods and services, not just basic goods and services, efficiently and cost effective. Key to economic development, of course, through industrialization, research process, and so forth. Also key contributor to tax income, so supporting the state investments. And often we look at the private sector to plug the gap of investments. Today, in the global green transition, the look is for where is the private sector, or how can the private sector plug the gap of the huge infrastructure deficit that's out there. And more sustainability, impactfulness through ESG, where ESG takes a center stage in decision-making of private capital investment. So private investments, the private sector is really important for any economy. The other question is, okay, if the role is so important, why do we need to enhance it? Well, unfortunately, the level of participation of the private sector differs from country to country. It's not always the same. In developing countries, it's 90%. In emerging markets, it's less than that. And depending on the country, it can be lower or higher. But there are impediments. There are impediments for the private sector participation, which includes, for example, I mentioned just a few points, uncertainty about government policy and macroeconomic stability, and I think this was mentioned this morning in the morning panel. Red tape, contract enforcement, which is key. Access to finance is also one of the biggest issues, and taxes, especially if it's excessive taxing, is also an issue. But we have seen success stories. We have seen success stories in Korea, in Singapore, Malaysia, and Turkey. We heard this morning. Mr. Mohammed Sinjik was telling us that that they were able to get 50 billion in 20 years from the private capital to invest in key infrastructure assets. So with that in mind, I turn to my distinguished guest, and maybe I'll start with my good friend Kofi from AFREXIM. Kofi, you have, well, you're a seasoned professional with over 25 years experience in banking, development finance, and export credit guarantee business. You are the director and global head of guarantees and specialized finance at AFREXIM, and you lead the bank's guarantee program. And we've heard this morning about guarantees and the importance of it for the private sector. And prior to joining AFREXIM, you were the senior manager in charge of finance at the Ghana Central Bank, where you were an adjunct lecturer at the University of Ghana and University of Education, Winneba. You're a chartered accountant, a graduate from Henley Business School, University of Reading in the UK, and University of Sorbonne, Paris, France, where you had an MSc in Corporate Management and Finance. And you've got a lot of other degrees that... So I think the question to you is, and we've seen how last year Afrexim had a record year in terms of profits, which I congratulate you for. But is this a reflection of a increased activity in the private sector throughout Africa? Do you see a growing role for the private sector in Africa at the moment, despite the challenges that I just mentioned and that are there? And how does your institution, or what does your institution do to support this, and what kind of incentives do you give?
No, thank you, Khalid. As you know, Afrexim Bank is a trade policy institution. Our mandate is to support trade and trade-related investments in Africa. And when we are talking of trade, it's a private sector that handles trade. Trade activities are done by private sector. Yes, our operations, a significant part of it is more in the trade area. But when you look at the African trade, you observe that it's concentrated. Major countries and the kind of business that we do attract the kind of trade. So you see Egypt, you see Nigeria, you see Morocco, you see South Africa, and possibly Angola. They account for a significant part of the African trade when you look at the volumes, and the other countries then follow. Now, can we say that our performance really is a sign that the private sector generally on the continent is striving? Well, to some extent, yes, but the message is that there's more room for improvement. There are a lot of areas that as a continent we need to do. The impediments, as you've heard in the morning, yes, are still issues. From the policy-wise, when you are a private sector, remember they are profit-driven. They want to put money in there, they know that they can get something positive out of it. If certain measures are not in place, you will struggle to get the private sector to come in there. You can talk of what's the gender with the enabling environment, certain regulatory issues, others are talking of taxes and the rest. But there are certain also issues that are not necessarily financing that is a problem. There are certain things that all that they need is partnership and network. They need issues of addressing some of the constraints that if they go in, they know that they cannot get their money back. I was in Asia last week and trying to attract private investors to participate in some transactions that we are doing for some of these countries. And the kind of questions that they are asking, yes, we understand you. We know that A, B, C, D is clear for us. But what shows that if we put our money in, they will get our money back? What is the guarantee? And then the currency issues and all these kind of things came in. Are we getting government support? No. If you are doing private sector, why do you want government support and all those things? But some of these things also bring out what, as a development finance institution, we are to do. It's a sign that we have a work to do. And Afrexim Bank, our role is not just financing. Our role also is facilitation. How do we facilitate? How do we ensure that Africa private sector participates in the infrastructure development that is happening across the continent? The continent spends about 66+ billion in terms of infrastructure growth that we are talking of. But when you look at this spending, significant part of this goes to some contractors outside the continent. Does it mean that we don't have qualified and quality contractors on the continent to bid? The answer is that there are certain structural issues that are not available. So when they are bidding, those entities out there, they are bidding because of the fiscal constraints of our countries, they are bidding EPC plus F. An African entity, let's use Orascoms and the rest in Egypt here, is bidding for a project in, say, Kenya. And he's bidding with an entity, say, in the US. He's coming with EPC plus F. USSM is supporting this entity. Who is supporting this Orascom? The end result is that the contract will go to the US entity and the continent is losing. Such structural issues, how do we deal with those things? And some of the things that Afrexim Bank is doing is how do we work with our member countries and create certain solutions that will also make certain projects, certain activities competitive for such entities to participate in such business. We've worked with the Central Bank of Egypt to help set up National Export Credit Agency. Afrexim Bank is looking to also put in place some solution that could also offer what the ECAs are giving to their country exporters, such that if we work with the national entities, we will be able to support these countries and these private sector entities to be able to compete. So at least there will be level playing field. We've seen that certain things also require certain regulatory issues. The AFCFTA, we all know the kind of potential that it is coming. When I'm traveling, I'm a Ghanaian, I'm based here. I have the privilege to be here by virtue of the work that I'm doing. Let's assume that I'm a businessman and I'm coming here. The kind of visa time that it will take and all those things. How do we clear these barriers? And that is why, as a DFI, it is important that we work with the governments, we work with AU, we work with the AFCFTA Secretariat to ensure that those basic things that affect trade can be eliminated. Of course, financing is key. We should not only leave them. We have to offer the kind of financing solution that can help them to deliver. Afrexim Bank, what we are doing is not providing the financing. We are also promoting what we call the ETCs, export trading entities. All that we are trying to do is, why don't we identify African champions, some entities that we know that if we can give them the required support, they can also become the giants that we've seen elsewhere. And these are some of the things that we are doing. We've been taking some African entities to go to other countries to see the opportunities out there. Because you realize that sometimes there are certain things that are in our continent. Private sector, if they know this information opportunity, they can leverage those things. But sometimes they are not even aware. People will be importing salt from Brazil and the rest. Meanwhile, there are plenty of salt in West African area. These tiles that they use for building, Egypt produce a lot. But you move around, you realize that people are importing these things from Spain and the rest of the world. The question is, why are these countries not importing from Egypt? Sometimes it's a function of information. And Afrexim Bank, some of the things that we are doing as part of facilitation is to bring these traders together. And we've started the last, I think, 4 or 5 years, introduce this intra-African trade fair. The objective of it is to bring parties together for them to know the potential on the continent so that people can tap into these opportunities out there. How can we know that Orascom can do some resort that we are seeing the beautiful things here? When you go to the Victoria Falls and all those things, others are coming to do. How can we know that? You have to bring them, you have to let them know that if you can help facilitate, there's opportunity there out there. And of course, the financing. When they are coming, they need to make sure that they get the financing that will make their business successful. And this one, we will mention that as a DFIs, we have a role to play. Afrexim Bank, we continue to work with our partners, the AFD, the Chinese DFIs and the rest. I think it's something that we have to continue to do that so we can promote the kind of things that we all expected that the private sector would take the lead. I believe that the discussion continues. The other things that I will touch on. Yeah.
Thank you, Kofi. And this is actually a quite very insightful analysis of business in Africa and how to really work around it. So it's not just funding is definitely important, and as you mentioned, some of the key things that you mentioned is facilitation, working on breaking down the barriers, whether it's travel barriers, information barriers, and really working with companies on matchmaking and giving them the opportunity to be out there and be seen. I mean, similarly, and I go now to maybe Asia, and because I'm quite curious to see if what Kofi's mentioned, if there are similarities in the Asian model. And Joachim von Amsberg is the special advisor to the president of AIIB, and from 2016 to 2021, he was AIIB's vice president for policy and strategy, and he drove the strategic direction for the bank, including its sectoral and country priorities, its investment strategy and programming, its economic analysis and research, and its operating budget. He oversaw the bank's environmental and social policies, other operational policies and their implementation. And prior to joining AIIB, he served in a number of progressively senior roles at the World Bank, where his last position was VP Development Finance with responsibility for the replenishment and stewardship of the International Development Association, which is the World Bank's fund for the poorest and for trust fund and partnership operations. Dr. von Amsberg holds a PhD in economic policy analysis and an MBA from the University of British Columbia. He holds a MSc in industrial engineering from the Technical University of Berlin. Joachim, similarly to AIIB, I mean, as I mentioned, I'm very curious to see similarities, but you are a relatively new player and you still benefit from institutional agility, which maybe allows you to structure products differently or move quickly on issues in general. In particular, how does this help you intervene on the issue of the private sector capital mobilization, for example, and to address all member country infrastructure needs of hundreds of billions, which are required in finance, but governments will not be able to come up with all this funding, and as we all understand. Can you give us a flavor of the type of partnership that you forge in doing your business? Does that also include, for example, upstream engagement, and how does that help the private sector in your view?
Thank you very much. I mean, since you are here at the AIIB annual meetings, you probably know that we were created in 2016. We opened our doors in 2016. In 2015, the world came together for some important decisions. One of them was, of course, the Paris Agreement, and we talk about that in other sessions, the importance of climate change, the energy transition. The second one was the agreement on the Sustainable Development Goals in the context of the United Nations, and the agreements around financing for development under the slogan, billions to trillions. And how to use billions of official development finance to mobilize trillions of private sector investment, essentially. And so these two, let's say, global agreements, the SDGs and the billions to trillions and the Paris Agreement, have been baked into AIIB's DNA from the beginning, because we were created at that time and these discussions and these agreements were forged. And so we could sort of from the beginning put into our priorities, first, the greening of infrastructure, the importance of energy transition, and secondly, the mobilization of private capital for infrastructure. And I'll talk more about infrastructure because that's our business, and how to bring private capital into infrastructure. And so from the beginning, that were two of our top priorities. Now, I think we, of course, looked very closely at what our peers, in particular peers like IFC and EBRD, who have worked in this field for decades, have done before. And I think it was very clear from their work and from our own analysis that billions to trillions does not work with slogans and political appeals. It will not work that the UN or national policymakers or MDBs say, well, we need trillions of dollars of infrastructure, and public sector only can spend so many billions, so private sector has to fill in the gaps. That's not how the private sector works. The private sector investors make calculations of their returns depending on the risk that they're taking. And if the return is adequate for the risk, they invest. If it's not, they stay away. It's in a sense quite simple, and I think we as development practitioners have to be hard-nosed about that, rather than idealistic, sort of just hoping the private sector will fill some gap that the public sector cannot meet. And so in the infrastructure space, it means looking very carefully at each subsector in each country and asking what will enable private sector investors to generate a return that is adequate for the risks that they're taking. And in particular, on the side of the risk, there's a lot that development institutions and the public sector can do to reduce the risk, so that, in fact, more investments become financially viable for private investors. And that starts, and we heard quite a bit of that this morning from the panelists in the opening session, that starts, of course, with the macroeconomic environment and the regulatory environment of a given country, the investment climate. Then it goes to the quality of projects that are being prepared, the engineering quality, the financial structuring quality, the risk allocation between different parties, in particular between the public and the private sector. And then goes to the expectation about how will projects be implemented. Will the public sector be able to deliver the land in infrastructure? One of the most challenging issues is always land acquisition. So will the land be available for the project on time, to implement it on time? Will the contracts that the private sector and the public sector enter, will they be honored from all sides, or will they be renegotiated? Will the off-taker, let's say in a power purchase agreement, be able to pay for the agreed payments? And then will the investor be able to freely use the returns to take them out of the country or reinvest them as they wish? So these are all the questions, and each of these questions will lead to some possibility to reduce risks and therefore increase the likelihood that private sector will come and invest. And in each of these areas, the multilateral development banks can contribute to reducing risks by helping with a regulatory framework up to through the upstream advisory work, where our peers are doing a lot. We are doing very little so far, but we hope we can do more in the future. They can help with the preparation of quality projects, and maybe most importantly, they can be trusted partners, meaning because our shareholders happen to be the governments that are the sponsors or the hosts of these investments, I think investors derive certain comfort from the investment, from the involvement of MDBs, because they have the comfort that if the governments that own these MDBs are participating, they will honor contracts and will make sure that the project gets implemented the way it was conceived and expected. So all these are sort of examples of where the multilateral development banks can open the door to private sector investment. Practically speaking, if I look at our region, which is mostly Asia, but for us that includes Egypt, and it includes then also investments in other parts of the world, Africa and Latin America, where we're little by little venturing into some investments. You see a very mixed picture. You see some sub-markets where private sector investment in infrastructure is really taking off. If you take, for example, the solar energy generation in India, it's like a subsector in a huge continental country, but you have very, very significant private sector investment going in there because the country has established clear targets, has established a framework that is sufficiently trustworthy for investors to come in, and you have very significant investments that accept quite tight returns. So sometimes there is very tough competition. We've been outbid, in a sense, in our offers for financing, which is a good thing, because if the private sector can do it alone, without the MDBs, that's a good sign. So you have those sectors. You have certainly countries in Asia where, for example, toll roads are mostly financed through private investment. Again, the type of private investment in infrastructure that is relatively easier to structure than other investments. For example, in the water sector, where I think the track record is much more mixed. There are some good stories, but also some quite significant failures. So what the MDBs do, or what we do, I think is essentially three things. First, we actually provide finance, just like other development banks. We offer relatively low cost, relatively long-term finance to private investors in infrastructure, either through our loan or through our equity products, and therefore directly on our balance sheet contribute to private infrastructure development. But that's modest because our balance sheet is modest. More important, I think, is the co-financing, meaning our participation in projects gives private co-financiers comfort that these investments will be carried out in accordance with the expectations, that returns will be available, et cetera, and that the risks are well managed because of the involvement of government in our banks. I think that's a very important element of what we do, and I think that's very similar to the business model of EBRD, IFC, and other peers in this space. The third thing we do is help create markets where there was no market. So in particular, by investing in weak frontier markets where the regulatory environment is weak, where the macro is weak, we're sort of pioneers who make their first step into the market and then expect others to follow. Or by creating, President Jin spoke briefly in the opening session about the securitization of infrastructure assets. That's something we're actually doing now at a significant scale with partners in both Singapore and Hong Kong. And let me spend a moment on that because I think it's a good example for creating a market that I think has pretty significant impact. So in both of those cases, financial institutions based in Hong Kong and Singapore, with our investment, we are equity and debt investors in those facilities, have set up special vehicles that purchase infrastructure loans from commercial banks, repackage them and sell them as rated securities to institutional investors. So this may sound like a complicated thing, but it's actually addressing a fundamentally important issue, which is that different investors have different risk appetite. You have banks, commercial banks, who are quite capable of carrying construction risk, the development risk, and who are willing to invest in these early high-risk phases. And you have institutional investors who want a tradable, at-scale security that is rated, that they can scale up their investments in infrastructure as an asset class, as President mentioned in the morning. And so by creating a market where loans are turned into rated securities, you're actually allowing the acceleration and the scaling up of the market. You take the loans off the bank's balance sheets, allow them to become securities that are taken off by institutional investors, and the banks can go back and invest in greenfield projects. And that's, I think, beginning to bring a lot more fluidity into the Asian market, still at modest scale. I mean, we're talking $500 million a year or so, but it's I think, one of the more promising developments to bring new capital into the infrastructure market. So that's sort of one of the examples of where we're trying to do something maybe a little unconventional, in addition to what I think is more traditional project finance business, where we're working again, because we are young, very often together with partners like EBRD, IFC, and invest in projects like the solar parks here in Egypt that were mentioned before, solar in India I mentioned, similarly wind energy in Laos, for example, that's being sold to Vietnamese consumers, so a cross-country connectivity dimension. So here you see sort of our corporate priorities of cross-country connectivity, green climate infrastructure finance, and mobilization of private capital come together. So that's, I think, the experience that we have so far. We've set ourselves some ambitious goals. We want that in the future, 50% of our finance goes into private sector projects. We do both public and private sector, but we want to spend 50% on the private sector. And we're quite rigorously measuring how much we're mobilizing, because our billions will always be small compared to the trillions that are needed. And it's hard work to mobilize, and so we want to incentivize ourselves, our teams and our partners to really track and then mobilize private investment at scale from the different buckets of private investors. Let me stop here.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think this was quite interesting, because I think you touched on all the topics and all the issues that were mentioned. You know, you talked about risk reduction. You talked about well, basically working around the issues of unsustainable policy or unpredictable policy to try and reduce the effect of that, and also talked about innovative structures like securitizing infrastructure and so forth. So this is very, very, very helpful. But I will turn now to my colleague Osino, who joined IFC in 2019 as a director of Western Europe, leading IFC's business development in the region. In his current position as director corporate portfolio, Osino provides leadership on how IFC can maintain a portfolio that balances profitability, risk, and development impact. He has over 18 years of experience in energy, climate change, international banking, and financial sector development. Prior to joining IFC, he was the director of renewable energy and energy efficiency at the African Development Bank. He has a strong experience in banking as a senior manager in BNP Paribas and in climate as director of programming at the Green Climate Fund. Osino holds an MBA from the Harvard Business School and is a graduate from École Polytechnique and École des Mines de Paris. The question to you, and taking from everything that has been discussed so far, because it sounds like there are great ideas out there, but IFC, you have a lot of experience since 1956, and you are solely private sector focused. You must have massive stories of lessons learned and what to do and what not to do to enhance private sector participation in many countries around the world, not just Asia and Africa. Can you give us a few examples here? Simply what works and what doesn't.
Thank you, Khaled. So good afternoon, Excellency, ladies and gentlemen. I'll go straight to the point. There is one word that comes to mind if I look at the lessons from our experience and what my colleagues have just mentioned. The word is trust. How to build trust in the system. It looks like, in many instances, that's really what is the catalyst of enabling private sector investment. Giving trust to private investors, that's what Egypt managed to do, actually, with this very large clean energy program that was announced about a year ago. It helped through a fair and transparent bidding process to provide trust to international bidders. And thanks to that fair and transparent process, the country was able, with the support of investors, including IFC, to mobilize $1 billion for solar and wind projects, for which will provide electricity to 1 million people. So that's an example where building trust and creating trust for international sponsors can yield good results. But I think one thing is important is that trust is not only, we should not only think about building trust for investors. We should also create trust at the level of consumers, the public. Those will be beneficiaries. Because often we focus our attention on the investors. And how do we build trust so that people actually are ready to open to private sector participation is by ensuring that the products and services that will be provided are of quality. And oftentimes you will see that there is subpar results because the products and services that are provided are not trustworthy, so the potential consumers are shying away from adopting them. So one good example, to answer your question, Khalid, is the work we've done in healthcare. And healthcare is an area where you need to trust the clinic or the hospital you're going to. And how did we do that? By providing advisory services to both public and private sector actors to set up standards and set up certification process so that when you go to a hospital or clinic that is certified for that process, you can be reassured that there is a certain level of standard. And IFC has financed in Egypt a hospital for 150 million recently, providing also this type of assurance. And last example is still building trust by providing standards and by ensuring quality in the financial sector. We said that we need, one of the problems is access to finance, especially access to finance at scale. So one of the examples that Joachim provided was how do you attract international investors in our markets by giving them the opportunity to buy standard products. Because the idea of standardizing the products is that they know what they buy, they know the terms, it's simple. So by helping set up guidelines and a minimum standard for these financial products, you actually open the floodgate for investors. So another example that we did with IBRD, here also in Egypt, we worked with the Financial Regulatory Agency to set up guidelines for green bonds. And by having these guidelines, by ensuring the compliance with the standards, we actually give comfort to international investors to come. So in a nutshell, the answer is, again, trust. And what we should avoid, actually, and what private investors don't want, on the contrary, is surprises, uncertainty, unpredictability. Because this uncertainty erodes that trust and make them a little bit lukewarm. I remember just before coming, one of my colleagues, and I will finish on that, one of my colleagues who is specialized in renewable energy in Africa called me and said, Hussein, I think we have a problem because when I look at my area, renewable energy, the level of investment in Africa and the appetite of sponsors in Africa has been declining for the past few years. And when I speak with our clients, they say that, well, they've tried, they really came 5-10 years ago with a high ambition, high intention, but it just takes too long and there's so much unpredictability in some areas, some regions, not everywhere, but in some regions that they're kind of directing some of their investment in other regions where it's more predictable, less volatile. It's not everywhere again. In Africa, fortunately, we have still some regions and some countries where there is strong appetite, but that's really the opposite of the certainty, the trust building that I was mentioning. So happy to elaborate. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And I think that ties into what we really want to hear from His Excellency, the Minister. Dr. Mohammed Maid, I have a very long biography and it's impressive, and we all know that you've worked with the Ministry of Finance in many different positions, but what the biography doesn't say, or what I read through it, is actually the challenges you had to endure and go throughout all these years. I refer to the word you mentioned, surprises. Egypt has been surprised, you have been surprised by a revolution, security issues, COVID, war in Ukraine. All these are challenges that you had to deal with, and yet in the midst of all that, there was a focus on gearing up on the PPPs, talking about initiatives for the hydrogen. Your ministry led the stakeholder engagement on the state ownership policy and put it into effect. The privatization happening now, the automotive initiative, all these are efforts by the ministry. And the question is really if you could shed light to the audience on these efforts of the ministry, but also in general, what government is also doing to support the private sector.
ما هي الجهود التي تبذلها الدولة لدعم القطاع الخاص؟ أود أن أشكركم جميعا لوجودكم في هذه الفاعلية. أن القضية فيما يتعلق بمشاركة القطاع العام مع القطاع الخاص.
Infrastructure investment. And as a general objective, looking at private sector participation, I see it is crucial for countries to ensure growth sustainability. And I believe that many countries who were able to succeed in ensuring that creating jobs and growth sustainability and improving services to its citizens, the private sector played a significant role in achieving all these objectives. Look at the case of Egypt. We may have to distinguish between two time horizons. As you've mentioned, after the 25th of January 2011, the country missed many main objectives or many, let me say, specific environment to attract or to ensure that the private sector will operate and ensure all these objectives of growth and creating jobs and all of that for many reasons. Number one, we lost security. Number two, there was problem with energy, whether electricity or natural gas and others. There was no energy in the country. Number three, the network of roads and bridges and all of that, there was no suitable one. Number four, there was no what the private sector needs in prepared land with all the utilities needed for that. Macroeconomic situation was not stable. So with all these circumstances, the environment or the ecosystem was not there for the private sector to lead. And people asking for achieving specific objectives. So at this environment, the state had to interfere and take the road to do to take the role to do that. And this was the main cause why the public investment or public activities in our economy at the current level of around 75% and the private sector of around 25%. It came to the point when I believe that we have invested heavily in infrastructure. We have fixed the issue of the network of roads, tunnels, bridges, and all of that. We created more than 25 new cities. We fixed the issue of energy with electricity, natural gas, and all of that. And also, we sorted out the issue of security, the issue of stability, and even at some time after the economic reform of November 2016, we restored economic stability. And I believe by the time of 2020 or 2021, we were heading to a stage when we say, okay, we've done our role. Now it's the role of the private sector to come and gradually take the lead of our economy. Unfortunately, what happened, COVID-19, inflation, war, a lot of challenges, the environment challenge or changes. So, but with all of these, which have a negative impact, we said, okay, we need to improve the environment and to start give the private sector the role to lead. And one of the steps was the state ownership strategy, which was announced last year, when we said, okay, now we will leave some of the economic sectors gradually, and some of them immediately, and some of them over specific period of time, but we gonna go for the IPO program, and we gonna restore or restrain ourselves from investment in some sectors. This is number one. Number two, we issued the law which remove all the preferential advantages or incentives or some tax exemptions and all of that. And we issued the law to remove all of these preferential treatment for the public enterprises or the state-owned enterprises, to leveling the playing field for all. This is number two. Number three, we reformed the competition law, and we added some sectors to ensure that the competition in the market will be ensured in many aspects. We started to implement the privatization, or we started to implement what we call the IPO program with some deals we have announced. We know that some others, like, for example, to ensure that bureaucracy with the private sector will be removed, we issued what is called the golden license, when immediately we give a license to the private sector to reduce the time and the procedures in order to start operating and to start working, and also made available the prepared land with all utilities to the private sector in a quicker manner. We have to do more. Yes, we have to do more in order to ensure that the activities of the private sector move from the current level, which is around 25% to 65-75% over the medium term. And as a Minister of Finance, I would say to you, I love to see this happening. Why? Because in the previous period, it is a public investment who prepared all of that. Now, I want to get the return on what I've spent in order to pay back what I have spent, because eventually you borrow the money in order to fix some chronic problems of the country, with energy problem, with infrastructure problems, and all of that. We fixed all of this, but now it's the time to allow the private sector to operate and to increase its activities and to get back what you have spent. This is one. The second one, as I said, ensuring growth sustainability cannot be assured depending only on the public investment. No way. You have to get the private sector involved more, either by direct investment, either by public-private partnership. By any means or any way, you need to push for the private sector more involvement and attract more FDIs. This will ensure that growth will come from different angles, not concentrating only on one angle, which is the public investment. You have another challenge for Egypt, which is creating jobs. Creating jobs, we are a country with more than 1 million young people going to the labor market every year. You need to create jobs for that. So you need the private sector to take more role to create more jobs for young people. Egypt has a lot of opportunities, and I believe that gradually the private sector has to play more and more and more role. We love to see that. We will do all our best to ensure this will happen over the medium term, and we as a government working very hard to achieve that by all means, by legal means, by improving the ecosystem of the whole climate for investment. So we love also to see the MDBs helping the private sector to provide them with more capital mobilization and support them. I believe, as you've mentioned, the PIM ban. PIM ban is totally private sector. The government did not spend anything in PIM ban. And this is another example. And we, Mr. Ater Hanura knows that we love to see the private sector in the education, in the health. Building infrastructure for education need more investment. So we cannot depend only on the government to accelerate building more classrooms. We need the private sector to be with us. Universal health insurance. We had a conference some week ago or 2 weeks ago. I said, without the private sector, we will not be able to achieve the objectives of the universal health insurance, because we cannot depend only on the system to deliver its promises for the people. We need the private sector with us to ensure that we will be able to do. So even in the main objectives and main jobs of the government in health, education, and others, private sector has a role to play. So this is, I believe, this is what we would like to see in the coming period, more and more involvement and more private sector investment and more capital mobilization for the private sector into the public investment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. This was, well, I think this was, first of all, I think this is very passionate in the drive towards including private sector. And what I maybe liked very much about the session today is that indeed everyone had a chance to talk a little bit about the importance of the role of the private sector, and you were able to, through your examples, basically highlight sustainability as for the economy as a key through private sector participation, and many other factors, but also the role that the private sector plays, or how we enhance the role of the private sector has also been highlighted extensively. I turn to the audience because I think we have less than maybe 10 minutes, and see if there are any questions that people would like to ask our panelists. Okay, I don't know if we have microphones that we can, or we can.
Hi, my name is Ayman Al-Qasabi. Me and my partner Basil, we have a fintech startup that is based in Africa. We are specialized, one of our solutions that we offer is kind of like a solution for both sides of the private equity equation, both for startups and VCs. What we're trying to do is we're trying to build trust, reduce risk, and also kind of standardize how to calculate the value of a business. And we're trying to do this by doing the due diligence of startups on behalf of the VCs. We know Afrexim Bank is trying to enhance trade through the AFCFTA, and we also know about the PAPS system. So my question is to you, Mr. Kofi. How do you think PAPS will enhance private sector participation in the future?
All right. Are there any other questions that I can take together, or I should go ahead?
No, please go ahead.
All right. You know, why PAPS was set up was because of the challenges that we've seen private sector entities are experiencing. You buy goods from Kenya, you need dollars to pay for the goods. Somebody is also buying goods from you in Egypt. He equally needs dollar to be able to pay. The question is, why can't we use our EGP to make payments, and then your counterpart in Nairobi receives what he's looking for in Kenyan sharing? So what PAPS essentially is trying to do is to remove the barrier of trade which is caused by foreign currency issues. So you will be in Egypt, you can trade in any of the member countries of the bank using your Egyptian pounds. So you will not be worried about the shortage of dollar or whatever, but you will focus on doing your business, selling whatever you are selling, whatever service that you are selling. And the countries that are also at the receiving end will also receive it in their currency. And there will be a central point that will do the balancing. So it will not be a problem for you to look for the FX before you can do trade. So that's essentially what PAPS is trying to do. And it is mainly for the SMEs. We've seen that a lot of banks in some of our member countries have registered into the program, and their members are doing some trade. So they go through the system. So you go through the system and do your trade. You can sit in your office and you do your trade with the necessary burden with the foreign currency that you need to settle and have the FX constraint. So it is there, and we believe that as PAPS roll out fully, hopefully the kind of challenges that we are facing on the FX side will reduce a bit, and the central bank will then focus on building their reserves for other things other than using it to deal with the kind of problems that we are all facing. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the gentleman in the second row had a question. The microphone is over there.
Well, I'm a little concerned about, my name is Edward Coffey. I'm from the Mana River Group in Liberia. I just want to address the question about trust and its implication on promoting the topic that is on the board. Firstly, the question of trust is something that has always been used. We can't trust those Africans, we can't trust them, and you're putting people against other people as a result. Nobody trusts Africans. They come up with regime changes, destroy economies, and do all kinds of things there. And those affect the mentality of trust. Those degrade the purposes for which these economies interact with each other. And as a result of that, there is this continuing degradation is affecting the African people, and it has to be addressed. And sometimes when Africans see it, it's so shameful. But the issue here is, you look across the landscape, bilateral loans have been forgiven by many countries. Maybe when people were kids, they heard, oh, the Africans, they don't pay their loans, and people go and pay for them, and that news permeates the atmosphere, and it still remains on the minds of people. What we are talking about is Asia and Africa. And you look at China, what it has done across Africa, all the infrastructure development everywhere. That's trust. They trust us. If you're from the US somewhere and they told you a long time ago those Africans don't pay their loans, so we don't trust them, you still stick it in your mind when you're getting older, then it's kind of difficult. You got to change your mindset. Africa is a place to be trusted. Like for me, the Mana River Group, Starting out of school, I went around and I saw things that were never done. I know that in Liberia, where I live, 1976, the government set up Mana River Union. There is a waterfall there that can produce electricity for all the countries there. A waterfall that has a potential of providing 1,000 megawatts of electricity. That electricity can produce steel, can produce tires. You can develop an industrial complex there. Nothing has been done in so many years. Are we still talking about trust, or are we talking about potentials? We have potentials. All these countries that you're looking at, they have potentials. And this old legacy thought about trust has to be forgotten. Everybody here is talking about guarantees and other things, and you come here talking about trust. I think you got to change your mindset. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I guess as a general comment, I don't know if anybody wants to comment on this, but I think the element of trust that we spoke at the panel and was the private sector trusting the environment that it can invest in. So certainly not the aspect of countries trusting other countries, but I don't know, Joachim, since it was mentioned that China is investing in Africa, maybe you want to say a few...
Yeah, I actually don't want to comment on the trust between countries or entire continents. I take your point, but I think there's an actionable part to it, which relates to the much more specific investment environment for a specific sector, where a government can actually act by drawing from good experience, by preparing contracts that have been tested, by having arbitration mechanisms in place so that investors know what will happen if there's a disagreement about the investment, by helping build a judicial system where investors can go if they have a dispute with another private party, for example. So I think trust is a very big word and a really important concept, but one can address it at a different level. And I think this is the kind of level of the specific investment climate which is probably more actionable in the short term. If I was a government and wanted to attract private investment, that's what I would work on. And in a sense, look around the world and see where has investment gone, what have been the contractual settings, and then how can institutions like the MDBs or other international bodies be used to create, to reinforce trust. I mean, that's a role that MDBs quite often play, is in a sense help governments make credible commitments to third parties. Because these governments are our shareholders, we can sort of play a bit of a trust-building role, but at a much more micro level than I think the level that you were alluding to, much more at the level of a specific investment. Will I get my money back? Will the contract be enforceable? Or will there be interventions that will mean that, that I won't get my money back and therefore won't make the investment in the first place? And we're quite happy to play that sort of facilitator, honest broker role that we can play as multilaterals.
Yes, I just would like to reinforce that point. We are not speaking here about trust between countries. We are speaking about mechanisms that can give confidence to a private sector entity to invest. One example, for instance, is the establishment of what we call credit bureau and the availability of information. So if you are a bank, you will lend money to a firm or a person more willingly if you have information on that, on the credit worthiness of that person. So establishing this kind of mechanism builds trust in the system. So that's what we are talking about here.
You see, issue of trust is the foundation of business. If you want private sector to participate in business, then trust have to be there. If there's no trust, there's no business. It means that I'll be putting my hand there, and I have to be sure that when I open my hand will still be there. It will not be cut off. So the question is, private sector is a business. They are there to make money. Yes, of course, other countries have them. I believe China doing that investment, they know that when they put their money there, they can get that thing. And possibly the others have the way they are looking at things. The question is, how do we, based on what Minister said, they are putting all that is necessary to make sure that they can attract the required private sector investment in there. The next thing is, how would you as an investor, after putting all these measures in place, put your money there? There may be other things that you will have concern. And that is why issues of trust instruments and the rest are there. Guarantee that we provide, what exactly guarantees are trying to do? It's a trust instrument. Just to give you the assurance that, look, if you believe in what we are telling you, that the government of Egypt has put all the necessary structures in place, put your money in here. If you don't get what we are saying you will get, we are standing behind and we will pay you, you will get your money back. That is what trust is talking about. And I believe it is a critical issue that all of us, as we try to attract these investments into our part of the world, we should make sure that we exhibit that kind of element in whatever we are doing so that we can get the required partnership, if I should call it, into the kind of world that we are operating. I will leave here.
I have to be honest with you. Trust is not a one-side coin. Trust is a two-side coin. It's trust on both sides. One, yes, you are absolutely right. Africa needs growth, development, infrastructure. Africa needs to create jobs. Africa needs to have its prosperity. And it's not fair. When you need the financing for that, Africa is treated differently. I always remember what is called Africa Premium. So you got the finance higher, it's just because you are in the continent of Africa. This is not fair. We need the financial market to trust Africa. We need the financial institution to trust Africa and its future. And you mentioned some who invested, some who trusted the future of Africa. So definitely, this is one side of the coin. The other side of the coin, it's on our shoulder. We need to ensure stability. We need to ensure our regulatory environment is up to the level which can be looked at in the way to attract those who want to come. We need to ensure that our financial system is working properly. So what I'm trying to say, you are absolutely right, that Africa needs a lot, and it is fair for Africa to get what it deserves to get. But on the other side, we as an African have a role to play, have a homework to do, to ensure that this trust on both sides will be built over the time and will eventually benefit our people, because we are working for our people. We want to improve our people's future and living standard and to do more for them. So private sector will not come unless they are satisfied, they are happy that they will make, yes, they will contribute to the development, but eventually they need a return on the shareholders' money. They need to work in an environment which is predictable, stable, and minimum level of concern or uncertainty. So this is my contribution to what you said. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. And I think we've come to the end of our time. I'm very sorry, but I'm sure everybody's really tired and wants to go to dinner. I'll take your question privately afterwards. Maybe we can discuss and respond to you. But I'll take it privately afterwards, and I'll get you the answers. No worries. Look, I don't think the role of the private sector in enhancing it is a debate. I think it's a discussion of shared experiences and knowledge. So the discussion will continue. It's on our minds. It's every day, and unfortunately, this is the end of our panel discussion. But the topic will continue to be discussed future-wise. Thank you very much again, distinguished guests, and hope to see you in a similar discussion soon. Thank you. Thank you.